In this podcast, I'm going to do a introduction to the Pastoral Epistles, but in another one, I'll focus in on the theology of pastorals. So we call First and Second Timothy and Titus the Pastoral. This has a tradition that goes back for a couple of hundred years. It was Augustine who first referred to one of these letters as a kind of pastoral rule, and later on, somewhere around the um 1900s, our first commentary on these letters that described them as pastoral epistles was written. And so the reason why they're called pastorals is because these letters are addressed to individuals as opposed to congregations, and about instructions, how these individuals are going to carry out their responsibilities and roles. In other words, how they will pastor, how they will minister to, how they will oversee or take care of the congregations. So, a couple of things here about who wrote the pastorals. So, the First and Second Timothy and Titus are oftentimes questions about their authorship. Of course, they are identified as coming from Paul, and there are several internal arguments that give support to the idea that this is work done by Paul. Certainly, there are the personal claims that are there. There's the description of Paul's former life that is provided, though it has to be acknowledged that someone who wants to pose as Paul could certainly talk about Paul's former life. So that description of the Paul's former life is, not nearly that strong or convincing. The author's relationship to recipients in the pastorals oftentimes indicate relationships that we know of from other books about Paul, particularly in Acts. So several of the same names occur in the book of Acts. They occur in Romans, First Corinthians, um, First and Second Corinthians, First Thessalonians, Second Thessalonians, in Philippians, as well as Colossians and Philemon. So, if someone accepts these other books, well, not Acts, but Romans through Philemon, as being by Paul, and you recognize those names, and here in these letters you have also the same names, again, that gives the suggestion that this is written by Paul. But again, if it's written by someone posing as Paul and who might know this other information, that may not be as convincing. The external arguments for Pauline authorship are probably what's more decisive for those who accept that they are by Paul. There are allusions that are made by early Christian writers, such as Clement and Ignatius, Polycarp, and Justin Martyr. Now, notice I say allusions, not citations. So, what we have in these other authors, we don't have these authors saying, as the Apostle Paul wrote, and then quote something out of the pastorals. What we have in these authors' work is words, phrases that are also occurring in the pastoral epistles. And so, for those that are looking for support for Pauline authorship, we'll point to these allusions and say, well, you see, Clement, Polycarp, Ignatius, Justin Martyr, they knew this was written by Paul and they're using this information. But it also could be said that, well, these words or phrases that exist within these other Christian authors are being utilized by the one who has penned the pastorals. So it's not, um, you know, absolute confidence, but for those who are looking to support Pauline authorship, that's what they might point to. Irenaeus really is the first to give a kind of confirmation that Paul is the author of these. So people who want to see these as coming from Paul, that's probably their strongest external argument, that someone within, close to 100 years after these letters were supposedly written, making this claim. The arguments against Pauline authorship, well, some notice that a lot of the personal elements fade into the background. Now, he does mention his former life there in First Timothy, and there are some other things that are reflective of Paul's situation. But Paul oftentimes in his other letters refer to past events, past experiences, and those kinds of things are not there. So so that raises some people's concern. This may not be by Paul because he's not following that style. The primary purpose of the letters seemed to be to transmit regulations that are intended for others. So, in other words, although it's addressed to Timothy and addressed to Titus, really this information is about how others are supposed to act. So, how the congregation is supposed to behave. So, what we know from Romans and First Corinthians and Philippians and First Thessalonians, Paul addresses the congregation. So, he writes a letter, and this is a letter that's read to the entire congregation. Now, the pastoral epistles are more likely to have read before a group. There are indications that it's not really a private letter. It's really a letter addressed to a person, but that most likely would have been read orally in front of others, probably because this is supposed to give credibility to both Timothy and Titus as Paul's apostolic representative. So, anyway, noting that this is different from what Paul oftentimes does, that again raises the question about its authorship. Tatian, who is a second century Syrian apologist, rejected 1st and 2nd Timothy as from Paul. But again, we don't know how much to put weight on that because one of the things in the pastorals that is condemned by false teachers is that false teachers forbid marriage. And Tatian is a Christian who also teaches against marriage. So Tatian may see this material as somehow or another written by those who want to continue to promote Christians in marriage. And since he wasn't of that persuasion, then he did not want to see this as authoritative or coming or legitimate, but a false writing in order to continue pushing that particular view. The pastorals are absent in an important series of papyri called the Chester Beatty Papyri. This is quite a controversial thing because the Chester Beatty Papyri is a scroll, it was a roll, and the problem is that with the Chester Beatty Papyri, we have several of the last pages or the last parts of the scroll that are missing. It was worn away, eaten by bugs or something like that. And those who use this as an argument against Pauline authorship say, look, we can know how long this roll was, and even if we had this roll completely, there still would not have been enough room on it for the pastorals. So the pastorals were left off. They weren't included in this source to indicate that someone was thinking of them as authoritative as coming from Paul. But others will note that, well, yes, it may not be enough pages for a script that is written in the same size. But if the scribe were to start writing in slightly smaller, seeing that they were running out of space on their scroll, then they could still get the pastorals in there, and they're just lost or gone because the scroll has been deteriorated. So it's an interesting question. It's again not a slam dunk against Pauline authorship, but it would be used by those who want to cast out on it. Another thing that's kind of noticing the style here, the correct teaching is not presented, but again, it's taken for granted. In other words, as if everybody already knows. And so that may not be too strong of an argument, really, when you're thinking about Timothy living in Ephesus, because the church in Ephesus is a church that has been around for a while. They don't need to have correct teaching presented again. They should already know it, and it can be taken for granted. Now, that might be stronger for teaching in a written form for Titus on the Isle of Crete, because that would be a relatively new church. And so, in that sense, maybe correct teaching not being presented in Titus might throw some weight into thinking why it's doubtful that it's been written by Paul. Arguments also against Pauline authorship. It's difficult to find a place for the pastorals in the portion of Paul's life that is known to us, particularly by Acts and Paul's own letters. So when you start looking at what Paul says to Timothy in chapter 1 about when he left Timothy in Ephesus and as he moves to Macedonia, that little bit of travel information doesn't fit with what we have in Acts. And this idea of Paul having evangelized on the Isle of Crete and leaving Titus there. We don't have any information about that in the book of Acts either. So, so the whole kind of background that we see as well in 2 Timothy, of the different travels that Paul has, none of that is reflected in Acts or any of Paul's letters. So in order to account for this, those who still see Paul as the author, they would point to the idea that Paul was most likely released from his first imprisonment. In the book of Acts, we see at the end, Paul is under house arrest. And so the theory is, well, he was tried, he was found not guilty, he was let go, and he continued on his travels. And that's how he then went back to Crete, did some evangelizing, went back to Ephesus, had Timothy with him, left Timothy there, did some more travels, as 2 Timothy indicates, and got arrested again, this time brought back to Rome, this time found guilty and then executed. So kind of 2 Roman imprisonments is required for those who want to see the pastorals as legitimately from Paul. Now, this is probably one of the strongest arguments against Paul as the author, and that is it's full of new vocabulary. They have the largest percentage of new words in them, and some of the vocabulary, such as savior, appearance, seems to refer to technical terms that come out of Hellenistic cults, especially the cult of the ruler. And so some of these things are pointed to. Now, sometimes those who want to defend Pauline authorship will say, well, Paul is addressing a new context, new situation. Maybe he's a little bit older and he can use new words. Other people can use new words. Of course, you have to bear in mind as well that some studies have been done about people as they grow older and how much new vocabulary do they actually increase with. And actually, most people don't really increase their vocabulary that much as they grow older. Now, of course, if they are getting more education, they may increase their vocabularies and terms. But generally speaking, people don't have a huge shift in new vocabulary. So the vocabulary issue is an important one when thinking about whether or not Paul has it. Of course, those who want to defend Pauline authorship can say, well, Paul may not have actually penned it. Maybe somebody else penned it, but Paul is behind it. He's speaking. Somebody else is writing. They're putting it into their own words, using their own vocabulary, but he's authorizing it. So that may be true. We may use something like an amanuensis for this. So we're not. Again, it's quite a strong argument, but it's not a conclusive one. The author uses vernacular designations instead of original Pauline words like good conscience, to be sound, the grace that brings salvation. These are not typically Pauline expressions, and here we have them in the pastorals. We could also probably add there's a lot of Pauline expressions that don't really occur in the or themes or ideas that are not really in the pastorals. That's surprising. Some have argued, well, the concern seemed to be for church organization, and that this concern for church organization really belongs to the 2nd century. It wasn't really part of Paul's concern in the 1st century. Having the overseer, having the deacons, having this kind of structure in place, dealing with false teachers. But again, that one's not too convincing to me. If Paul, on his first missionary journey with Barnabas, went back and installed elders, as what the book of Acts indicates, and if Paul, writing to the Philippians, indicates that there are elders and deacons, I think Paul would have an interest in some kind of organization. It seems kind of strange to think that Paul would have no sense of organization in mind when he would leave a group, trusting different people to be responsible for things. So But nevertheless, that is suggested. That's why we're seeing this stronger emphasis on organization. Whereas if you look at 1 Corinthians, Paul seems to have much more of a kind of an informal view of different people taking responsibilities, using gifts, much more kind of uh, fluctuating uh, assembly that's going on, rather than one that's structured and organized by sole individuals who are responsible for making sure things take place. And unlike the uniform presentation of regulations in the Didache, the literary structure of 1 Timothy looks more like a collection of various materials. And so rather than just a letter that was composed, some have argued, well, really what you got here in 1 Timothy, at least, is different bits of information. Maybe they come from Paul, but somebody has collected this information and then kind of tied it all together. I'm going to just very briefly here just highlight the structure of the pastorals. So we see that the structure of Titus is, opens up with the salutation, a reminder to appoint elders, charge to rebuke the harmful leaders, exhorting Christians towards healthy moral household behaviors. So household concepts is important for thinking about the function of the pastorals. There's a theological foundation for ethical exhortations. There's an exhorting Christians towards healthy moral behavior with outsiders. Again, a theological foundation for these ethical exhortations. Exhorting Christians to avoid divisive church leaders. And then finally, a kind of a closing instructions and greetings. In 1 Timothy, again, we'll start off with a salutation. The concern with avoiding false teachers, and this is important here for 1 Timothy, because there are some controversial things in 1 Timothy. Anybody interpreting 1 Timothy needs to be aware that the overall intent of the letter has to do with false teachers. So everything that you find in 1 Timothy needs to be thought through in connection with the role, the influence, the impact of these false teachers. Christians must behave peacefully in the household of God, so seeing the church as God's household. So just like there were household rules for a typical Greco-Roman house, ways which different people in the house ought to behave, so too in this house, there are different ways that people should behave that would be socially appropriate. Christian leaders must be an example of good conduct. Paul's reasons for encouraging the good conduct is in chapter 3, verses 14 through 16. And it's really chapter 3, 14 through 16 that we see the thesis of the overall letter, the purpose, why Paul has written this letter. And again, setting things in order in God's household. Timothy then is to be a teacher that instructs in godliness, because he's trying to combat the problems with the false teachers. Proper behaviors of groups within the household, including widows, including those who are in positions of as elders, and sometimes having to try them, the roles of other groups that exist within them, the old and the young, the widows, the elders, slaves, so all those within this group, how they should behave. So Timothy must confront and separate himself from the heretical, greedy teachers. So this idea of being greedy teachers is a common polemic against teachers in the ancient world, as it is today, to think that the only reason some people teach is because they are interested in money and they're just trying to take advantage of people. So Paul is using that polemic to describe the false teachers. Timothy must confront those who put their hope in riches. So this whole idea of greedy, not just the teachers themselves, but anybody. And there does seem to be this concern with money, especially when you look back at the instructions about women and what women should wear in chapter 2. What they're willing to wear, gold, pearls, or expensive apparel, indicates this obsession with wealth and flaunting of wealth. And then there's closing instructions and greetings. And with 2 Timothy, we see a salutation. Timothy here. This is more about Timothy's role as a minister. The encouragement for Timothy to be courageous and committed to the gospel. He's going to have to show determination, endurance, because we still have false teachers that Timothy has to address. And Timothy must show that he's not divisive like the teachers of the heresy, teachings that contradict what Paul has taught. There's ungodliness that is going to increase in the church as Paul tries to explain that these people who are departing, this increase of false teaching is kind of anticipated, it is expected that this kind of thing is going to happen. When you have false teaching, ungodliness will follow. Timothy is going to have to continue to follow the teaching examples of Paul. And then there's a closing charge for Timothy to preach the truth. Paul describes his situations and wants Timothy to visit him. One of the interesting things here is calling for John Mark, someone that Paul in the book of Acts has contention with, has disagreement with. Here, this John Mark is being called by Paul to come and visit him when he's in Rome, in prison. And then there's these final greetings and finals appeal. Now, we'll note here some of the reasons why the pastorals were written. So Titus was written to instruct Titus to choose and install elders on the island of Crete. It assumes that evangelistic effort of Paul and Titus on the island. 1 Timothy was written to motivate Timothy to withstand and combat false teachings. When Paul either traveled to Macedonia, he's in Macedonia or he's on his way to Macedonia, he instructed Timothy to stay in Ephesus. And 2 Timothy was written to encourage Timothy's courage and to ask him to come to Paul. And so Paul is in some kind of close confinement, most likely in Rome. Doesn't not explicit about that, but that's most likely what we're supposed to imagine. And Paul doesn't expect to be released, and he wants to see Timothy and John Mark before he is killed. So the last thing I'll just mention here is about the false teachers in the pastoral epistles. I think the false teachers and the activities and the impact of them is a major concern, as it is in other letters that are attributed to Paul or written by Paul. So they do seem to be Jewish. Their teaching is somehow another centered on the law. They seem to be fascinated with what Paul refers to as myths and genealogies. The term myth is, again, a polemic word to describe something that is a idea, concepts, teaching, story that is not rooted in what's real or credible. Genealogies is not the term for how we might use the word genealogies to talk about a list of ancestors, but since this English word kind of comes from a Greek word that means beginnings, this may be stories again about the beginnings of the universe or the beginnings of the world or the beginnings of human history. And so we are aware of Jewish stories, call them apocryphal stories, that sometimes engage with the beginning of creation or the beginnings of the human race, or the beginnings of the Jewish people. And what some scholars do think may be the case here, what is imagined, is false teachers who are wanting to export their ideas and wrap their ideas with stories based off of patriarchal stories or stories out of Genesis that lend support to what it is that they are teaching. There does seem to be some teaching elements of asceticism. In other words, some kind of value of denying taking certain foods or marriage or something else in order to present oneself as godly. And so the concern is, well, you might be able to engage in these activities and present yourself as godly, but real godliness is seen in good behavior, not in the abstinence of certain things, the control over certain appetites, physical appetites, but also control over one's moral behavior. There is an erroneous view of the resurrection. We may describe this as kind of a realized eschatology, as if believers in Christ are not going to experience a future bodily resurrection, but they have already been risen. They already have a new life, and once they're dead, that's it. You're done with. And so that is a different gospel than the gospel that Paul preached, which is a belief in a bodily resurrection of believers. And the last thing we could probably say is possibly they are elders, since there is an interest in appointing elders, control about appointing elders and their behaviors and having to judge elders. And interesting, in Acts 20, verse 30, Paul does say when he sees some elders, when he meets them, some Ephesian elders, he sees them in Miletus. He warns them that there may be wolves that will arrive amongst you. Now, the you there in Acts 20:30 is very interesting because the you may not mean amongst the church generally, but amongst the group of elders themselves. In other words, these wolves, these dangerous people, false teachers, may arise and be a part of the group of elders. And so, uh, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus may be picking up that worry or that concern that Paul foresaw. So that'll give us a kind of an introduction, basic introduction and backgrounds to the pastoral epistles, and then we'll look in a separate podcast about the theology, overall theology.